On October 25th, 1415, on a muddy field in northern France, around 6,000 exhausted English soldiers stood face to face with nearly 20,000 French troops at the Battle of Agincourt. The English were starving, sick, surrounded. Many of them were suffering from disease after weeks of marching through enemy land. Most were not knights. They were simple archers and farmers with bows. Facing them was the pride of France, elite nobles in heavy steel armor, riding war horses, trained for battle since childhood. They believed this would be an easy victory, but within just a few hours, more than 6,000 French nobles would be dead. Their army would collapse, and a small force led by Henry V of England would achieve one of the most shocking victories in military history. The year is 1415, and England and France are deep in a bitter conflict that historians would later call the 100 Years' War. For decades, English kings had laid claim to the French throne, all thanks to a tangled web of royal marriages and inheritance laws. The conflict had its ups and downs, but now, a new English king sat on the throne, and he was a man of singular ambition, Henry V. Henry was young, just 28, but he was already a hardened warrior and a canny politician. He had inherited a kingdom that was still a bit shaky. His own father had taken the throne by force. Henry knew that a big, glorious win in a foreign war was the perfect way to unite his bickering nobles, cement his own legitimacy, and maybe even fill the royal coffers with some plunder. And France, at that exact moment, looked like a prize ripe for the picking. The French kingdom was a mess. Their king, Charles VI, was known as Charles the Mad, and for good reason. He suffered from brutal bouts of psychosis that left him completely unable to rule. In this power vacuum, the French nobility had split into warring factions, mainly the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who were busy with their own bloody civil war. There was no unified leadership, just a nest of vipers squabbling for power. Henry V saw this division and thought, golden opportunity. After his ambitious demands, which included huge chunks of French territory and the hand of a French princess, were rejected, Henry invaded Normandy in August 1415 with about 12,000 men. His first target was the port city of Harfleur. Henry figured it would be a quick win, but the city's defenders were surprisingly stubborn. The siege dragged on for over a month, and while the city did eventually fall, the cost for the English was staggering. Men died in the fighting, sure, but way more of them died from the sheer filth of the siege camp. The bloody flux, a nasty form of dysentery, tore through the English ranks, killing thousands and leaving the rest weak and demoralized. By the time Harfleur surrendered, Henry's army was a shadow of its former self. The campaign season was ending, winter was coming, and his army was in no shape to continue a conquest. The smart move would have been to sail back to England and fight another day, but Henry was a man of immense pride and faith. A retreat would look like a defeat, an admission that his great God-sanctioned adventure had been a bust. So he made a fateful, some might say reckless, decision. Instead of sailing home from Harfleur, he would march his sick and weary army through enemy territory to the English-held port of Calais. The direct route was only about 100 miles, but the journey turned into a punishing 260-mile ordeal as the French blocked their path. It was a calculated gamble, a defiant gesture to show the French he could march right through their backyard. But the gamble quickly went south. The French, who had finally put their squabbles aside to deal with the invasion, had gathered a massive army. They shadowed Henry's every move, blocking him, forcing him on that long detour to find a crossing over the River Somme. Every day of the march was agony. Food was scarce. The autumn rains were relentless. The men, already sick, just got weaker. All the while, the French army grew bigger and more confident, just waiting for the perfect moment to crush them. Finally, on October 24th, near the village of Agincourt, the French army moved to block Henry's path once and for all. There was no more running. The English were trapped. As they made camp that night, they could see the endless watchfires of the French army, a glittering, terrifying reminder of just how outnumbered they were. For the English soldiers, soaked, sick, and starving, it must have felt like the end of the world. As the sun rose on St. Crispin's Day, the difference between the two armies was terrifyingly clear. This was a classic medieval showdown, but one where the type of soldiers mattered just as much as the numbers. The French army was the very picture of medieval military might. Modern estimates put their numbers at around 12,000 to 20,000 men. The heart of this force was its nobility, thousands of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms. This was the flower of French chivalry, an aristocratic warrior class that had ruled Europe's battlefields for centuries. Decked out head to toe in magnificent, expensive plate armor, they were the medieval equivalent of main battle tanks. A single French knight represented a massive investment in steel, a powerful warhorse, and a lifetime of training. Their plan was simple and traditional: a massive, overwhelming cavalry charge to smash the English line and trample the commoners. They were so sure of victory that the nobles actually argued over who would get to be in the front line, hungry for the glory and the ransoms they were sure to collect. They had crossbowmen, but the strategy, the glory, and the focus were all on the armored knight. Their leadership, however, was a council of high-ranking nobles, including the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret. This divided command lacked the singular authority of a king. Facing this steel tsunami was King Henry's English army. Numbering between 6,000 and 9,000 men, they were catastrophically outnumbered. While Henry had his own knights and men-at-arms in similar armor, they were the minority. The defining feature of the English army, making up almost 80% of its strength, was a class of men the French nobles looked down on: the longbowmen. These weren't aristocrats. They were yeomen, commoners, farmers, and craftsmen. But they were also professional soldiers, hardened by campaigns in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Their armor was light, maybe just a padded jacket and a steel helmet. They weren't weighed down by all that plate steel, but they carried a weapon that was, in its own way, more revolutionary than the finest armor: the English longbow. Made from a single piece of yew, the longbow looked deceptively simple, often taller than the man who used it. But in the hands of a trained archer, it was a weapon of mass destruction. It required immense strength to draw, with draw weights often over 100 pounds. A lifetime of practice actually deformed the skeletons of these archers, building up the muscles in their backs and shoulders. In return, the longbow offered a phenomenal rate of fire. A skilled archer could loose around 6 to 10 arrows a minute, several times faster than a French crossbowman. With an effective range of over 250 yards, an English archer could send a heavy bodkin point arrow high into the air to plunge down on enemy formations. While a direct hit on the best plate armor might not get through, the sheer volume of arrows could find the weak spots: the visor slits, the joints at the armpits, and especially the less armored horses. An army of 5,000 longbowmen could unleash a storm of over 30,000 arrows every single minute. It was, in effect, a medieval machine gun. This was the force Henry commanded, a small, professional, and unified army where the common soldier was the key to victory. Led by a single king who would fight alongside them, they were a world away from the top-heavy and divided French host. On paper, it was a mismatch. But wars aren't fought on paper. They're fought on the ground, and the ground at Agincourt would become England's greatest ally. The spot where these armies would clash wasn't some grand, open plain perfect for glorious cavalry charges. No, it was a narrow strip of recently plowed farmland, squeezed between the dense woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt. This geography was the first crucial factor that started to tip the scales away from the French. The field was only about 750 to 1,000 yards wide. For the French, this was a tactical nightmare. Their biggest advantage was their sheer number of knights. In this tight space, they couldn't spread out, flank, or use their numbers to overwhelm the smaller English army. The woods on both sides protected Henry's flanks, funneling the massive French army into a tight, compressed channel where they had to attack head-on. Henry V, a smart and experienced commander, saw this advantage immediately. He positioned his small army across the narrowest part of the field, creating a perfect bottleneck. He arranged his men-at-arms in the center, a solid core of steel probably standing 4 men deep. And on the flanks, he placed his trump card, the longbowmen. They were likely arranged in formations that jutted forward from the main line, possibly in wedges. The exact shape is debated by historians, but the purpose was clear. As the French charged the center, the English archers on the wings could pour arrows into their exposed flanks, creating a deadly kill zone. But the terrain held one more, even deadlier secret. In the days before the battle, it had rained, and rained, and rained. The freshly plowed field, with its rich clay soil, had turned into a thick, clinging, treacherous quagmire. A French chronicler wrote that the French soldiers were marching through the middle of the mud, where they sank up to their knees. So they were already overcome with fatigue, even before they advanced against the enemy. For a French knight, this was a catastrophe. Each man was weighed down by 60 to 80 pounds of plate armor. Every single step in that sucking mud would be a monumental effort, draining their strength. If a man fell, getting back up would be a Herculean task, if not impossible. For the English, it was a different story. The archers, in their light armor, could move with relative ease over the same muck that was swallowing their enemies. This was the stage Henry had set, a narrow field that canceled out France's numbers, woods that protected his flanks, and a surface of deep, exhausting mud that turned the French army's greatest strength, its heavy knights, into its greatest weakness. The trap was laid. All he had to do now was spring it. For 3 long, tense hours after sunrise, the two armies just stood there, watching each other across the muddy field. The French, confident in their numbers, were happy to wait. They figured the starving English would eventually have to launch a suicidal attack on their lines. Henry's men stood in disciplined silence. The king had forbidden any shouting, wanting total focus from his men. But as the hours dragged on, Henry knew he couldn't wait forever. His army was weak from hunger, and delaying would only make them weaker. He had to force the issue. He had to make the French come to him. Around 11 a.m., Henry gave a shocking order: advance. This was incredibly risky. His army, including his archers, had to move forward into bowshot range. The longbowmen had one more key piece of equipment: a thick, 6-foot-long wooden stake, sharpened to a deadly point. Each archer carried one, and before a battle, they'd hammer it into the ground in front of them, creating a makeshift fence of spikes angled toward the enemy. This was a critical anti-cavalry defense, and its use here would be decisive. Now, they had to pull these vital stakes out of the ground, carry them forward with their bows and arrows, and replant them several hundred yards closer to the French. During this move, they would be completely vulnerable. A well-timed French cavalry charge could have shattered them and ended the battle before it even began. But the French high command either froze, was too disorganized, or was simply too shocked by the audacious move to react. The English army marched forward, halting within extreme longbow range, about 250 to 300 yards of the French vanguard. The men-at-arms reformed their line, and crucially, the longbowmen hammered their sharpened stakes back into the soft earth, resetting their deadly hedge. The trap was primed. Henry had goaded the French. The veteran soldier, Sir Thomas Erpingham, reportedly threw his baton in the air as the signal. The waiting was over. The English archers drew their bows as one. The command was given, and with a sound like a monstrous, tearing sheet of fabric, the sky went dark. Thousands of archers loosed their arrows at once. Tens of thousands of arrows climbed into the autumn sky, hung for a moment, and then plunged down into the packed ranks of the French army. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. This first volley was likely aimed high, a plunging fire designed for maximum disruption. The French crossbowmen and archers, who had been placed bizarrely behind the men-at-arms, couldn't return fire effectively. The arrows rained down, thudding into men, and crucially, into the thousands of horses of the French mounted knights, who were positioned on the wings to sweep away the English archers. A horse is a big target, and unlike its rider, it wasn't heavily armored. The storm of arrows turned the French cavalry into a scene of pure chaos. Horses, maddened with the pain of arrowheads tearing into their flesh, screamed and bucked, throwing their riders into the mud. They bolted, uncontrollable, many of them stampeding straight back into their own infantry, who were just beginning their slow, heavy advance. The French cavalry charge, the move that was supposed to win the battle in minutes, was a complete disaster. Instead of breaking the English archers, the knights were broken themselves. The few who managed to press forward were either shot from their saddles or impaled on the sharpened stakes guarding the English line. Their attack had not only failed, but it had actively hurt their own army, churning the ground into a bloody quagmire and sowing chaos in their own infantry ranks. The arrow storm had beaten the first wave. Now it would break the second. With their cavalry shattered, the main body of the French army, the first wave of dismounted men-at-arms, began its advance. There were thousands of them, more men than in the entire English army. They were the elite of France, a walking forest of steel, but their advance was pure agony. Every step was a battle against the mud. The ground, already soaked and now torn up by thousands of panicked horses, clung to their steel boots. They sank to their knees with every stride. All the while, the English longbowmen kept up their relentless work. Volley after volley slammed into the French line. The archers now lowered their aim, firing directly into the advancing mass. While the best armor could deflect an arrow from the front, the sheer density of fire meant arrows found the gaps, the eye slits of a helmet, the vulnerable joints at the armpit and groin. Even when arrows didn't kill, their impact was like a blow from a sledgehammer, staggering men and throwing them off balance. The French line, once orderly, began to compress and buckle. The narrow field squeezed them so tightly together that men couldn't even raise their arms to fight. Those who fell were often trampled to death by their own comrades, pushing from behind. Some knights, exhausted and weighed down by their armor, fell face first and literally drowned in the mud and water that filled their helmets. They were exhausted before they even reached the English line. They had crossed 300 yards of hell, wading through a thick stew of mud and blood, under a constant, punishing torrent of arrows. The sky hissed with death. All around them, their comrades fell. By the time the survivors of the French vanguard finally stumbled into the English men-at-arms, they were a breathless, fatigued, and disorganized mob. The two lines crashed together with a sickening crunch of steel on steel. But this wasn't the glorious clash the French had dreamed of. The exhausted French knights, packed so tightly they could barely swing their weapons, met a line of fresh, steady English men-at-arms. King Henry V himself was right there in the thick of it, a crown on his helmet, fighting and rallying his men. The English line bent, but it didn't break. The fighting was a brutal, chaotic scrum in the mud. And then the battle's decisive moment arrived. The English longbowmen, having likely fired most of their arrows, made a choice that sealed France's fate. They didn't fall back. They dropped their bows. They drew their sidearms, hatchets, mallets, daggers, and short swords. Lightly armored and mobile, they were agile. Agile where the French knights were clumsy and exhausted. They swarmed off the flanks and plunged into the melee, a wave of ferocious killers. They surged around and through the gaps in their own battle line and fell upon the struggling French knights. This was butchery, not battle. The nimble archers could easily dodge the slow swings of a knight's heavy weapon. They worked in groups, surrounding individual knights, hammering them until they were dazed, pulling them down into the mud, and then driving a dagger through a visor slit or a gap in the armor. They were like a pack of wolves taking down a lumbering bear. The French vanguard, assaulted from the front by fresh soldiers and swarmed on the flanks by thousands of vicious archers, completely disintegrated. They were slaughtered where they stood. The sheer weight of their own dead and dying created a gruesome wall of bodies that blocked the path of the second French line advancing behind them. This second line, seeing the catastrophe, hesitated. They had to clamber over the slick pile of their own countrymen, all while the English archers, who had likely retrieved arrows from the dead, began to shoot again. The result was the same. The second wave was also cut to pieces. The battle had been raging for perhaps 3 hours, but it was already an unbelievable English victory. As the fighting died down, the field was an appalling sight. Thousands of Frenchmen lay dead or dying. Hundreds, maybe thousands more, many of them high-ranking nobles, had surrendered. The ransom money from these men would make the English victors rich for life. The battle seemed over. Then, a sudden alarm. A group of French survivors had staged a raid on the English baggage train at the rear of the army. At the same time, the third and final French battle line, which had been watching from a distance, appeared to be regrouping for a fresh attack. Henry V faced a terrifying choice. He was still outnumbered by the remaining French forces, and now he had thousands of prisoners in his custody, prisoners who outnumbered his own exhausted soldiers. If that third line attacked, and the prisoners realized their strength, they could rearm themselves with the weapons littering the battlefield. A stunning victory could instantly turn into a catastrophic annihilation. Henry had to make a split-second decision, and it was a brutal one. He gave the order, "Kill the prisoners." This was a shocking command, a flagrant violation of the chivalric code that said noble prisoners should be held for ransom, not slaughtered. Some English knights apparently refused the order, unwilling to murder the men who represented their future fortunes. But Henry was insistent. The archers, having no such chivalric hang-ups, carried out the grim task. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of French nobles who had surrendered were systematically executed. Only the most high-profile captives, like the Duke of Orleans, were spared, their ransoms too valuable to throw away even in a crisis. In the end, the French third line faltered and retreated, and the threat passed. The act left a dark stain on Henry's victory. While his contemporaries didn't criticize the decision, understanding the dire military necessity, modern observers have called it a war crime. It was a moment of cold, pragmatic cruelty that showed the brutal reality of medieval warfare lurking just beneath the surface of chivalry.